Welcome to LSB Feaster's Radio Aircheck and Classic TV channel.
Anderson in Jerusalem, who's been traveling with Mr. Kissinger and has some inside reports on what has been going on throughout the many days of negotiation. Jim, perhaps you could tell us what this all means. What is the meaning of the disengagement negotiation?
Well, there are several layers of what it means. At the very most superficial, it means that it's going to be an end to the fighting. And the fighting, although it hasn't gotten much attention outside of the state of Israel, has been considerable. It's been going on for about 2.5 months. Some 30 people have been killed on each side, and many, many more wounded. Plus the fact that it's always there is always a possibility that it could escalate into something nasty again, as we have seen before in this part of the world. That's the very top level, the very outer layer of the onion, as it were. Next is the fact that this is only the beginning of something else, that this is the first stage of what is hoped to be a peace agreement between Syria and Israel on one part, and Egypt and Israel on the other part. And then, more important perhaps, it is going to set a pattern which has never existed in this part of the world for the last quarter of a century, the last quarter of a century in which Israel has been born and become a nation. For the first time, a radical Arab nation, Syria, which claims to be the most ideologically pure of the Arab nations, has agreed to recognize Israel's right to exist within certain boundaries and has publicly done so, to the danger of the moderates who are now ruling Syria. In other words, the moderates seem to be now in control in the Arab part of the world, in control enough to sign publicly an agreement with Israel, a state which they had 5 years ago or even 5 months ago sworn to exterminate.
Do the Israelis seem to be pleased or satisfied with the negotiation with regard to the Palestinian guerrillas and any terrorism that might take place?
Well, it's difficult to say that the Israelis are ever unanimous on one thing or on anything at all. The saying here is that if you get two Israelis together, you then have three political parties. There are many people in this country who are extremely wary and mistrustful and are saying that Israel is giving everything in terms of territory and receiving nothing really except what it should have been getting all along, the right to exist. However, there are others who recognize that the tide of history has been running away from Israel, especially since the October War, and that the alternative to this negotiated solution, whether it's satisfactory or not, the alternative to a negotiated solution now would be a series of wars, the last one of which Israel would lose and would therefore be exterminated as a state. As to the terrorism, it is that part of the agreement is still secret. We don't know the exact wording of it, but we do know that that was the last hang-up as far as the Israelis were concerned. The Israelis apparently wanted a somewhat stronger assurance on terrorism than they got. But it is believed, and we will find out that in the next 24 hours, it is believed that the United States has given a partial guarantee to Israel that Israel will have the right of retaliation, retribution, if the Syrians should indeed permit terrorism to operate from its territory.
Jim, what is the significance of Golda Meir's resignation within 24 hours?
They're really not connected directly. Everything in politics is connected indirectly. But what it amounts to is that Golda Meir is 73 years old. She's lived through one era of her country's history and finally became fatigued, really, by the nasty infighting within her own party and also within the rest of the parliament. She had gotten to the point where she could fight the Arabs, but she was simply not willing or able to spend the rest of her life fighting her own people in her own parliament.
But you don't think it has any...
She felt that this was the time to step down.
But no direct relationship with the negotiation.
Time.
No direct relationship with the negotiations?
I'm sorry, Jerry, I didn't hear
I
that.
say the resignation of Golda Meir had no direct relationship to the negotiations just concluded?
No direct relationship, except that it's a crowning achievement to her career, which began even before Israel was a state. But she would have been willing to have resigned if that were necessary to get the agreement through the Israeli parliament. But it's not necessary. There's a preponderant majority, as far as we can tell now, for the agreement. I think her resignation is directly concerned only with the one thing, the domestic internal political situation in Israel.
Jim, a final question. What is the mood of the Kissinger delegation now?
I can answer it both personally and by observation. Relief and fatigue. No one guessed that it was going to go on this long, and no one guessed that it was going to be so complicated, so complex, so emotional, and so intricate. Every little last bush and rock had to be negotiated. And as the man whom we have to call a senior American official because of the various ground rules, as this senior American official said, never before had he been involved in negotiations where both parties were willing to scrap everything right up until the last minute, no matter the amount of time and goodwill and emotion that they had invested into the negotiations up till then. Everybody had the feeling, in fact, a certain knowledge, that up until this morning at about 2:30 a.m., when the Israeli cabinet met to finally approve it, up until this morning, the whole thing could have flown apart like a rusty old machine, and the 5 weeks would have been wasted. Not only the 5 weeks, but the impetus would have been lost, the momentum of the negotiations would have been lost, and everybody here was very frightened to think what effect this would have on the Egyptian disengagement agreement, which has already been settled in January, of course, and which has gone on quite smoothly. But it probably would have forced the Egyptians to pull back from the moderate role that they've been playing since then.
Is there a Russian force nearby? Are Russians observing what is going on, Jim?
Well, the Russians, of course, are in the Mediterranean, as the U.S. Sixth Fleet is. Andrei Gromyko was in Damascus yesterday when Henry Kissinger passed through, but they spent about 20 minutes together. And the Russians really played no role in it, except the quite important negative role, which is that they did not impede or obstruct or lean on the Syrians to back off from the negotiations that have already been done. And Kissinger helped achieve that neutral, negative Soviet role by talking to the Soviets even before he came to the area and asking them not so much for their cooperation, but rather for their forbearance.
Now, after the signing in Geneva of these negotiations for disengagement, what is the next tour? What will happen in terms of a final peace settlement?
I'm sorry, Jerry, our line is fading. It's getting very static.
I said,
Can you repeat the last question? I just picked up part of it.
What will happen after the signing in Geneva? What will happen in terms of where we go toward a final peace settlement?
Well, the first thing that's going to happen after the signing in Geneva within the military committee between Syria and Israel is that there will be a ceasefire. The very next thing is that there will be an exchange of wounded prisoners. The next thing is that there will be an exchange of prisoners in general. And that's an extremely important thing for Israel, almost exactly the same way that the return of the American POWs some 14, 15 months ago was an important thing as far as the American public was concerned. After that, everybody right now is just sort of sitting back and breathing hard, and no one really wants to plan in definite, concrete steps what's going to happen next. But the most logical thing to happen would be that there'd be another disengagement agreement, this one between Jordan and Israel. This one would be relatively simple because there's not been any shooting along that border, and the Jordanians have been among the most moderate of the Arab world. At that point, in fact, coinciding with that point, the Arab world and Henry Kissinger are going to begin talking about the second stage, which will be the final stage of the peace treaty. In other words, Israel is going to have to begin negotiating to pull back to something like the 1967 borders. This is going to change from area to area depending on Israel's security needs. But the next step is going to have to be a pullback pretty much like the 1967 borders, but not exactly like it. And then after that, there may even be some diplomatic toing and froing, such as recognition between some of the Arab states and Israel. And finally, at the very end of the road, and I wouldn't even begin to estimate this in terms of months or years, someone's going to have to deal with the problem of the city where I'm sitting now, Jerusalem. It is the worst kind of problem as far as Kissinger is concerned. It's not only emotional, it's theological as well as political. And no one right now can think of an easy solution for that one, which is going to be the final settlement in the Middle East.